The air in the boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and cheap malice. Director Park sneered, gesturing toward the woman standing by the door. "Someone get this maid out of here. She's been lingering with that tray for 10 minutes. This is a billion-dollar merger, not a cafeteria." Veronica Jones didn't flinch. She adjusted her sleeves, her gaze cool and unwavering. The executives laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. "She probably doesn't even speak the language," Park added, tossing a crumpled report at her feet. "Pick that up and get out." The heavy oak doors slammed open. Lee Young-jae strode in, the dragon tattoo on his neck pulsing with suppressed rage. The room went silent. Without a word, he bypassed his chair, grabbed Director Park by the throat, and slammed him against the marble wall. "You want her to pick that up?" Young-jae hissed, his voice a low, terrifying growl. He reached into a black folder and hurled a stack of notarized deeds across the table. A red arrow on the front page pointed to a single name in bold ink. "Look at the signature, you fool. You aren't standing in my office. You're standing in hers." The scent of industrial lemon bleach was the first armor Veronica Jones put on. In the pre-dawn gray of Seoul, the glass monolith of the Xinguang Group didn't look like a corporate headquarters. It looked like a fortress designed to keep the world out. Veronica adjusted the rough fabric of her gray uniform, the V. Jones name tag pinned slightly crookedly, a deliberate touch of imperfection. To the elite who paced these halls, a straight name tag suggested ambition. A crooked one suggested a woman just trying to survive the shift. She stepped through the service entrance, her heart hammering a rhythm of defiance against her ribs. She was a ghost in a kingdom built on her father's stolen blueprints. 10 years ago, the men in the penthouses had signed away her family's future with a flick of a gold-plated fountain pen. Today, she was back to collect the ink. "Keep your head down, Jones," the floor supervisor barked, not even looking up from his clipboard. "The executive wing is off-limits until 5 a.m. If I catch you near the chairman's office, you're sacked before your first break. Understand?" "Yes, sir," Veronica murmured, her voice a soft, melodic contrast to the harsh fluorescent lights. She pitched her tone lower, masking the Ivy League refinement that usually sharpened her vowels. As she pushed her heavy yellow cart toward the elevators, the polished marble floors acted as a dark mirror. She watched her reflection, a black woman in a servant's shroud, and felt a flicker of icy resolve. They would look right through her. They would discuss their offshore accounts and their backroom betrayals while she emptied their wastebins. The elevator chimes echoed like a funeral bell. When the doors opened on the 48th floor, the atmosphere changed. The air was thinner here, filtered and expensive. Silence draped the hallway like a heavy velvet curtain. Veronica began her work, the rhythmic swish-swish of her microfiber cloth against the mahogany desks becoming a countdown. She reached the heavy double-oak doors of the CEO's suite. This was the inner sanctum of Lee Young-jae, a man the tabloids called the Dragon of Seoul. She paused, her hand hovering over the biometric scanner she knew she couldn't trip, yet. Suddenly, the heavy doors groaned open. A man stepped out, his presence hitting the hallway like a physical weight. He was tall, his black suit tailored so sharply it looked like a weapon. A flash of ink, the tail of a dragon, crept up from his collar, disappearing behind a jawline that could cut glass. Veronica froze, dropping her cloth. It fluttered to the floor like a white flag. Lee Young-jae stopped. His dark, impenetrable eyes didn't slide past her as the supervisors had. They lingered. He looked at the cloth, then up at her face, his gaze stripping away the uniform until he was looking directly into her soul. "You're new," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. Veronica didn't look down. She couldn't. "I'm the shadow, sir," she replied, the truth slipping out before she could catch it. "I'm here to clean up the mess." The clock on the wall of the executive library ticked toward 3 a.m., a rhythmic heartbeat in a building that never truly slept. Veronica moved with the practiced silence of a shadow, her microfiber cloth dancing over the spines of ancient, leather-bound books. She wasn't looking for dust, she was looking for the seam in the mahogany paneling where the private server was rumored to be housed. A sharp click echoed through the room. Veronica didn't jump, but her muscles coiled. The heavy scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco preceded him. Lee Young-jae stood in the doorway, his silk tie loosened, the top buttons of his shirt undone to reveal the jagged black ink of the dragon's wing on his collarbone. He looked exhausted, the kind of weariness that comes from carrying a crown made of lead. He didn't look at her at first. He walked straight to the jade tea set resting on a low table near the floor-to-ceiling windows. "The water is already hot," Veronica said quietly, her voice barely a ripple in the silence. Young-jae paused, his hand hovering over the porcelain pot. He turned, his dark eyes narrowing as they found her in the dim light of the library's corner. "You." The shadow from the hallway. "I took the liberty of preparing the oolong," she continued, stepping into the pool of light cast by a brass floor lamp. "You looked like a man who hasn't slept in 3 days, Mr. Lee. Caffeine would be a mistake. This will ground you." He watched her for a long beat, the silence stretching until it felt like a physical wire pulled taut between them. Most people in this building tripped over themselves to bow or fled the room when he entered. This woman, this maid with the steady hands and the gaze that felt like a challenge, simply stood her ground. "You speak as if you know what it feels like," Young-jae murmured, sinking onto the leather sofa. He gestured to the space opposite him. "Pour it." Veronica hesitated, then crossed the room. She knelt with a grace that betrayed years of etiquette training she was supposed to have forgotten. As she poured the amber liquid, the steam rose between them, blurring the lines of their stations. "I know what it's like to live in a house full of ghosts," she said, handing him the cup. Her fingers brushed his, a brief, electric contact that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin. Young-jae took a sip, his eyes never leaving hers. "A maid who serves philosophy with her tea. Who are you really, Veronica Jones?" "I'm the person who sees what everyone else ignores," she replied, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked out at the Seoul skyline, the lights reflecting in the glass like fallen stars. "And right now, I see a man surrounded by sharks who think he's lost his bite." Young-jae leaned back, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, the first genuine expression she had seen on his face. "If they knew you were this observant, they'd be terrified." "Let them be," she whispered. "It's more fun when they don't see it coming." The tranquility of the library shattered like dropped porcelain. Before Veronica could withdraw her hand from the tea service, the heavy oak doors burst open. 3 men in charcoal suits, not corporate executives, but soldiers of the old street guard, stormed in. They didn't carry briefcases, they carried the scent of wet pavement and rusted iron. Young-jae didn't flinch. He set his teacup down with a terrifying, deliberate click. As he rose, the silk of his shirt strained against his shoulders, and the dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to writhe in the flickering lamplight. The lead man, a scarred veteran of the Busan docks named Cho, spat on the marble floor. "The elders say you've grown soft," Young-jae, Cho growled, his hand disappearing into his jacket. "Living in a glass tower has made you forget where the blood comes from." "I haven't forgotten," Young-jae said, his voice dropping into a register that made the window panes vibrate. "I just decided I was done painting with it." In a blur of motion that defied his exhausted state, Young-jae moved. He didn't wait for the draw. He lunged across the low table, his fist connecting with Cho's jaw with a sickening crack. The other 2 closed in, and the library transformed into a theater of primal violence. Books were swept from shelves as bodies collided with the mahogany. Veronica backed into the shadows, her breath hitching. She saw the glint of a blade, a short, jagged tonto, aimed at Young-jae's ribs while he was occupied with the second attacker. Without thinking, she grabbed the heavy brass floor lamp. She didn't scream, she swung. The base connected with the assassin's wrist, the blade clattering across the floor. Young-jae spun, delivered a devastating kick that sent the final man spiraling into a glass display case, and then silence reclaimed the room, punctuated only by heavy, ragged breathing. He stood over the groaning men, his knuckles split and bleeding. He turned toward Veronica, his face a mask of cold fury that slowly cracked when he saw her holding the lamp, her knuckles white, her curly hair haloed by the moonlight. He stepped closer, the dragon on his neck pulsing a deep, angry red. "I told you to be a shadow," he rasped, reaching out. His blood-stained thumb brushed her cheek, leaving a smear of red against her dark skin. "Shadows aren't supposed to bleed for monsters." "I'm not bleeding, Young-jae," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the ink on his throat, realizing the dragon wasn't just a decoration. It was a map of every life he had outrun. But you are. He looked at his hands, then back at her, a raw vulnerability flickering in his eyes that no CEO or Mafia lord should ever show. They won't stop. Now that they've seen you, they know where my heart is beating. The morning sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse office, casting long, sharp shadows across the wreckage of the previous night. The broken glass had been swept away, and the scent of ozone and blood had been replaced by the sterile, masking aroma of expensive wax. Young-jae sat at his desk, his hand wrapped in a clean white bandage that felt like a shackle. His gaze was fixed on a thick stack of legal documents, the merger agreement that was supposed to be his salvation, or his tombstone. He flipped to page 42, expecting the same dense, circular jargon that his high-priced attorneys used to hide their own incompetence. Instead, his breath caught. In the margins, written in a precise, elegant hand, were dozens of annotations. They weren't just notes, they were a surgical deconstruction of the contract's hidden trapdoors. A predatory clause regarding intellectual property rights had been struck through with a single, bold line. Beside it, a rewritten paragraph sat in perfect, technical Korean, closing a loophole that would have drained billions from the Shinguang Group by the end of the fiscal year. Young-jae leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking in the silent room. He didn't need to check the security tapes. He knew the slant of that handwriting. He remembered the way she had looked at him in the library, not as a frightened servant, but as an architect observing a structural flaw. The door clicked open. Veronica entered, pushing her cleaning cart with the same rhythmic, unassuming cadence as always. She didn't look at him, heading straight for the waste bin near the window. The lawyers told me this deal was airtight, Young-jae said, his voice sandpaper dry. He didn't look up from the papers. They told me the technical patents were protected. They lied. Veronica paused, her gloved hand resting on the rim of the bin. She didn't turn around. Lawyers are paid to win cases, Mr. Lee. They aren't always paid to tell the truth. This isn't just a correction, Veronica, he said, finally standing and walking toward her. He held the document out, the red ink glowing like a fresh wound in the sunlight. This is a masterpiece of corporate warfare. There are maybe 5 people in Seoul with the intellect to see this trap. None of them wear a gray uniform. He stepped into her personal space, forcing her to look at him. The air between them hummed with a different kind of tension now, not the adrenaline of a fight, but the magnetic pull of 2 people who finally recognized each other's masks. Who taught you to read a merger like a roadmap? He whispered, his dark eyes searching hers for the truth she had buried under layers of bleach and silence. Veronica's mask finally slipped, a flash of raw, brilliant pride illuminating her face for a fleeting second. My father built the foundation of this company, Young-jae. I'm just making sure the roof doesn't cave in before I'm finished with it. The Grand Hyatt ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and whispered treachery. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light over the elite of Seoul's underworld, their laughter ringing like hollow metal. Veronica moved through the crowd with a silver tray balanced on her fingertips, the white lace of a server's apron cinched tight over her waist. To the intoxicated men in tuxedos, she was merely a moving part of the furniture, an invisible vessel for champagne. Her pulse was a frantic drum against her ribs. Tucked into her ear was a tiny, skin-toned receiver, and beneath her tray, a high-gain microphone hummed. She was hunting a voice. She spotted Director Park in a secluded alcove, his face flushed with plum wine. Beside him stood a man whose presence felt like a cold draft, a high-level fixer for the rival Osung syndicate. Veronica drifted toward them, her head bowed as she offered a tray of canapes to a passing socialite, lingering just close enough to catch the drift of their conversation. Young-jae is becoming a liability, Park hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of greed and fear. He's looking into the old patent filings. If he digs too deep, the whole foundation crumbles. The dragon's neck is exposed, the fixer replied, his voice a low, mechanical monotone. The gala's fireworks start at midnight. That's when we'll take him. In the confusion, no one will see the blade. Veronica's hand shook, the crystal flutes on her tray rattling almost imperceptibly. She needed to reach Young-jae, but he was standing at the center of the room, a glass of water in his hand, surrounded by a wall of sycophants and security detail. He looked every bit the king, oblivious to the fact that his throne was rigged with explosives. As she turned to slip away, a heavy hand clamped onto her shoulder. She froze. "More champagne, girl," a voice boomed. It was one of Park's associates, his eyes glazed and wandering. He leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. "And maybe a smile? You're far too beautiful to look so worried." "I apologize, sir," Veronica whispered, her mind racing. "I'll fetch a fresh bottle immediately." She wrenched herself away, her eyes scanning the room until they collided with Youngjae's. Across the expanse of the ballroom, through the smoke and the sparkle, his gaze locked onto hers. He saw the apron, the tray, and the sheer terror in her eyes. He didn't move, but the subtle tightening of his jaw told her he understood. The maid wasn't supposed to be here. The clock on the wall struck 11:45. 15 minutes until the fireworks. 15 minutes to save the man who was slowly becoming the only thing she had left to lose. The first boom of the fireworks rocked the balcony, a violent spray of crimson light that mirrored the danger lurking in the shadows. Veronica didn't wait for the second. She surged through the heavy velvet curtains, her servant's apron torn away, stumbling into the drenching midnight rain of the Hyatt's private gardens. "Youngjae!" she cried out, her voice nearly swallowed by the thunder. He was there, standing near a stone lantern, his silhouette a jagged line against the neon-blurred skyline of Seoul. He had already neutralized the first assassin. A man lay slumped in the hydrangeas, but Youngjae's shirt was shredded at the shoulder, the white fabric turning translucent in the downpour. He turned, his eyes wild and predatory, until they landed on her. "I told you to stay away," he roared, reaching her in 3 long strides. He grabbed her arms, his touch searing despite the cold rain. "This isn't your war, Veronica. Why are you still here?" "Because you're an idiot who thinks he has to die alone to be a hero," she shouted back, her chest heaving. The rain plastered her curls to her forehead, and her eyes burned with a mixture of fury and a terrifying, newfound devotion. "Park is moving now. The whole board is in on it. If you die, I lose everything. I lose my father's legacy, and I lose." She stopped, the words catching in her throat as another firework exploded, gold this time, illuminating the raw vulnerability on Youngjae's face. The dragon looked human, broken and desperate for a reason to keep fighting. "You lose what?" he whispered, his grip softening, his thumbs tracing circles on her damp skin. "I lose the only person who actually sees me," she breathed. The tension that had been building since that first cup of midnight tea finally snapped. Youngjae didn't hesitate. He pulled her flush against him, his hand tangling in her wet hair as he crushed his lips to hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision of 2 lonely orbits, tasting of rain, salt, and the desperate adrenaline of a life lived on the edge. For a moment, the world of corporate coups and blood debts vanished. There was only the heat of his body against hers and the rhythmic pulse of the dragon tattoo beneath her fingertips. When he finally pulled back, just an inch, his forehead rested against hers. Their breaths mingled in the freezing air, 2 white plumes of smoke in the dark. "If we survive tonight," Youngjae rasped, his eyes searching hers with a terrifying intensity, "I am burning this whole kingdom down for you." "Don't burn it," Veronica whispered, a lethal spark returning to her gaze as she pulled a flash drive from her pocket, the data she had swiped while the assassins moved. "Help me rule it." The safe-house apartment in Itaewon was a stark contrast to the gilded cages of the Shingguang group. It smelled of old paper, strong coffee, and the sharp, metallic tang of hardware. Youngjae stood in the center of the cramped living room, the bandage on his hand standing out white against the dim, blue glow emanating from the far corner. He had followed her here after the gala, his protective instincts overriding his common sense, but the man who had walked through the door wasn't prepared for what he found. Veronica sat at a desk cluttered with 3 monitors, her fingers flying across a mechanical keyboard. Behind her, an entire wall had been converted into a tactical map. It wasn't a map of the city, but a skeletal breakdown of his family's empire. Red strings connected his uncles to shell companies in the Caymans. Black ink circled the names of board members who had betrayed his father, and at the very center, pinned with a heavy brass tack, was a photo of Youngjae himself. Youngjae walked toward the wall, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood. He traced a line from his own photo to a document titled Project Genesis, his father's stolen patent. "You didn't just stumble into that hallway, did you?" he asked. His voice was unnervingly quiet, a low vibration that seemed to pull the heat out of the room. The tea, the corrected briefs, the gala. It was all a calculation. Veronica stopped typing. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of the computer fans. She turned her chair slowly, the blue light of the screens casting sharp, alien shadows across her face. "I told you I was here to clean up the mess, Young Jae. I just didn't tell you how big the mess was." He grabbed a folder from the desk, flipping through pages of bank statements that shouldn't exist. His own private accounts, laid bare. He felt a sickening surge of betrayal, the memory of their kiss in the rain suddenly feeling like a tactical diversion. "Am I just a target to you? A variable in your revenge plot?" Veronica stood up, stepping into his space until the heat of her anger matched his. "I have spent 10 years living as a ghost so I could find the people who murdered my father's soul. I thought you were one of them." She jabbed a finger at the wall, specifically at a cluster of notes near his photo. "But look at the dates, Young Jae. I stopped investigating you 6 months ago. I started protecting you." He looked at the notes. They weren't evidence of his crimes, they were logs of the threats against him. She had been tracking his assassins before he even knew they existed. "Why?" he rasped, the folder trembling in his hand. "Because the Dragon of Soul is the only thing standing between the board and total chaos," she whispered, her voice breaking with a sudden, raw vulnerability. "And because I realized that you're as much a prisoner of that building as I am." Young Jae looked from the war room back to the woman who had built it. The betrayal didn't vanish, but it transformed into something more complex, a terrifying realization that he wasn't her protector. He was her partner. The 48th floor of the Xinguang building had never felt colder. For a week, the air between the CEO's office and the janitorial closets had turned to ice. The camaraderie of the midnight library was gone, replaced by a professional distance that felt like a serrated blade. Veronica kept her head down, her mop bucket rattling against the marble like a funeral drum, while Young Jae became a ghost behind tinted glass. He watched her through the security feeds, his eyes fixed on the grain of the monitor. He saw her scrubbing floors with a precision that bordered on penance, her back straight, her face a mask of African granite. He wanted to summon her, to demand an explanation for every red string on her wall, but the pride of a wounded dragon kept him paralyzed. He couldn't distinguish between the woman who had kissed him in the rain and the operative who had mapped his downfall. The silence spilled into the boardroom. Young Jae sat at the head of the table, his presence so oppressive that Director Park fumbled with his fountain pen. "The merger finalization is in 3 days, Chairman," Park stammered, his eyes darting toward the door. "We just need your signature on the final asset transfer." Young Jae didn't answer. He was watching a flicker of movement in the reflection of the window. Veronica was outside in the hall, polishing the glass of the double doors. She didn't look in, but she paused for a fraction of a second, her cloth hovering over the spot where his reflection met hers. It was a silent communication, a warning or a farewell, he couldn't tell. Late that night, he found a single slip of paper tucked into the book he had been reading in the library. No tea was waiting this time. The water in the pot was cold. "Trust is a luxury neither of us can afford," the note read in that elegant, sharp script. "But silence is a confession. If you sign Park's papers on Friday, you aren't just giving away the company. You're giving away the evidence of who killed my father. Choose your side, Young Jae." He crushed the paper in his bandaged hand, the sting of the wound a dull reminder of the blood they had shared. He walked to the window, looking out at the city where she was hiding in plain sight. He was the most powerful man in Seoul, yet he felt utterly powerless against the Maid, who had dismantled his life with a microfiber cloth and a few well-placed truths. The Cold War was ending, but the real battle was moving into the light. He realized then that he didn't fear her betrayal, he feared her absence. The silence wasn't a wall, it was a countdown. The trap snapped shut with the clinical precision of a guillotine. It began with a misplaced diamond, a 5-carat heirloom belonging to Director Park's wife, left conspicuously on a velvet tray in the executive lounge. By noon, The building's internal security had swarmed the 48th floor. Veronica stood in the center of the corridor, her hands raised, surrounded by 4 guards whose faces were as cold as the marble walls. Director Park paced in front of her, his silk tie fluttering with every agitated breath. He looked less like a grieving victim and more like a man savoring a long-awaited kill. "Empty the cart," Park sneered, gesturing toward the yellow plastic bins. "We know it's in there. A woman like you, coming from nothing, seeing such wealth every day. It was only a matter of time before your true nature surfaced." Veronica remained unervingly still. Her eyes weren't on Park, but on the glass office at the end of the hall. Young-jae stood behind the tinted pane, a silhouette of frozen indecision. "I haven't touched your wife's jewelry, Director," she said, her voice echoing with a calm that seemed to infuriate him. "I suggest you check your own coat pocket before you make a mistake you can't undo." Park's face twisted into a mask of purple rage. "Search her." As the guards moved in, the elevator chimes rang out. Young-jae stepped into the hall, his presence instantly dropping the temperature of the room. He walked with a slow, predatory gait, his eyes fixed on the guard who had grabbed Veronica's arm. "Take your hands off her," Young-jae commanded. The guard recoiled as if burned. "Chairman, she's a thief," Park cried, thrusting a finger toward Veronica. Security found her hovering near the lounge. "My wife's ring is missing. We must make an example of her. It's the only way to maintain discipline among the help." Young-jae looked at Veronica. For a heartbeat, the Cold War of the past week vanished, replaced by a desperate, silent plea for trust. He saw the flicker of a trap in her eyes, but it wasn't the one Park had set. It was a countermove. "Search the cart," Young-jae said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The guards tore through the cleaning supplies, dumping bleach and rags onto the floor. Finally, one reached into a side pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Park let out a triumphant crow, but as the guard opened it, his face went pale. It wasn't a ring. It was a digital recording device, the same one Park had used to discuss the hit at the gala. "That's not mine," Park stammered, his confidence evaporating. "No," Veronica whispered, stepping forward until she was inches from his trembling face. "It's yours. And it's been live-streaming to the chairman's private server for the last 5 minutes." The silence that followed was deafening. Young-jae looked at Park, the dragon on his neck pulsing with a lethal intent. "Director," he said softly, "I believe you're in the wrong office. And the wrong company." The legal fallout of Director Park's failed trap provided the perfect smokescreen. While the board scrambled to distance themselves from the disgraced director, the true shift in power happened in a small, wood-paneled office in the heart of Seoul's administrative district, far from the prying eyes of the Xinguang security cameras. The room smelled of old paper and ink, a stark contrast to the synthetic luxury of the penthouse. There were no flowers, no guests, and no silk-draped altars. Young-jae stood by the window, his tuxedo replaced by a simple charcoal suit, his gaze fixed on the bustling street below. He looked less like a king and more like a man who had finally found a shore to land on. Veronica stood beside him, draped in a cream-colored silk dress that flowed like liquid pearl. She wasn't carrying a mop or a hidden microphone. She carried only a single gold band and the weight of a decade-long quest for justice. "The board thinks I've spent the last 48 hours mourning the theft of the company's secrets," Young-jae said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He turned to her, his dark eyes softening in a way that would have terrified his enemies. "They have no idea that the moment we sign these papers, the dragon becomes a servant." "We aren't just signing a marriage certificate," Young-jae, Veronica replied, her voice steady but her fingers trembling as she picked up the pen. "We are signing a merger of 2 bloodlines. My father's brain, and your family's muscle. It's the only way to survive what comes next." The clerk pushed the documents forward. They weren't just matrimonial. Tucked beneath the marriage license was a private contract transferring Young-jae's voting shares into a joint trust. Young-jae took her hand, his thumb brushing over the pulse point at her wrist. "You could have just taken the evidence and ruined me along with them. Why this? Why bind yourself to a man with a target on his back?" Veronica looked up at him, her gaze unflinching. "Because I don't want to just ruin them. I want to build something they can't touch. And because when you kissed me in the rain, I realized I'd rather fight a war with you than win one without you. He smiled, a rare, devastatingly handsome expression that reached his eyes. Then let's give them a wedding present they'll never forget. They signed their names in a single, synchronized motion. As the clerk stamped the gold seal onto the paper, the flash-forward blurred. The quiet of the office dissolved into the roar of the present day, back to the looming corporate showdown. The wedding bands were hidden, his beneath a leather watch strap, hers on a chain under her servant's collar, but the alliance was forged in steel. They were no longer a CEO and a maid. They were the architects of a revolution, waiting for the perfect moment to tear the roof off the building. The silence that followed Veronica's voice was more violent than a scream. Vice Chairman Kim looked at her, his lip curling in a sneer of pure, unfiltered condescension. The help is speaking out of turn again. Someone drag this woman out before I have her arrested. Young-jae didn't wait for the security guards to move. He surged from his seat with the explosive grace of a predator. In one fluid motion, he grabbed Kim by the lapels of his $5,000 suit and slammed him against the marble wall. The impact echoed like a gunshot. The crystal chandelier overhead rattled, casting jagged, dancing shadows across the terrified faces of the directors. You want to talk about the help? Young-jae hissed, his face inches from Kim's. The dragon on his neck seemed to pulse with a life of its own, dark and lethal. You want to talk about status? With his free hand, Young-jae reached into the black folder on the table and hurled a stack of notarized documents across the polished marble. They slid like ice, fanning out until they stopped in front of the shaking directors. A bold red arrow on the top page pointed directly to the signature of the majority shareholder, the person who had quietly bought up the Xinguang debt while the board was busy plotting their petty coup. Look at the name on those deeds, you vultures, Young-jae growled, his voice a terrifying vibration. You aren't standing in my boardroom. You're standing in hers. Veronica stepped forward, her arms crossed over the chest of her gray uniform. She didn't need a crown. The sheer, cold authority in her eyes was enough to dwarf every man in the room. She watched Kim struggle in Young-jae's grip with the detached interest of a scientist observing a dying specimen. The company my father helped build was stolen by men like you, Veronica said, her voice echoing with a decade of suppressed rage and newfound triumph. You thought I was here to empty your trash. But I've been spent the last few months emptying your bank accounts. Every secret, every bribe, every cent you funneled through the Busan docks. It's all in my hand now. Kim gasped, his eyes darting between the woman in the servant's dress and the Mafia heir holding him by the throat. This is impossible. You're just a maid. Young-jae released him, letting the man slump into his leather chair like a discarded doll. He walked to Veronica's side, his hand coming to rest firmly on the small of her back, a gesture of both protection and submission. She is the CEO of the Jones Shin Group, Young-jae announced, his gaze sweeping the room with a final, chilling decree. And as of 5 minutes ago, she owns every seat at this table. You aren't just dismissed. You're sacked. Get out before I let my old habits handle the exit. The air in the boardroom had turned graveyard cold. The directors sat paralyzed, staring at the documents that had turned their world upside down. Veronica walked to the head of the table, her footsteps rhythmic and certain, the sound of her low heels clicking against the marble like a gavel striking a sentence. She didn't sit in the chairman's chair. She stood behind it, looking down at the men who had once looked through her. Director Han, she began, her voice a calm, clinical edge. She didn't look at him, but at the digital tablet she pulled from her cleaning cart, a device that now held the digital keys to their lives. Section 4B of the Corporate Charter allows for immediate termination in the event of gross moral turpitude. I have the logs of the $3 million you diverted to the Seoul waterfront project last spring. You have 10 minutes to clear your desk. Security will meet you at the door. Han's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to protest, but Young-jae stepped into his line of sight, the dragon on his neck visible as he crossed his arms. Han scrambled out of his chair, his dignity trailing behind him like a shredded cape. Vice Chairman Kim, Veronica continued, her gaze finally landing on the man who had called her the help moments ago. You've spent 20 years building a legacy on the bones of smaller innovators. My father was the first. You didn't just steal his patents, you tried to erase his name. But names have a funny way of resurfacing when the tide goes out. Kim's hands shook as he gripped the edge of the marble table. You can't do this. The legal battles will last decades. I am the legal battle, Kim, Veronica whispered, leaning over the table until she was inches from him. The scent of her lemon bleach armor mingled with the expensive musk of his fear. I bought the firm that represents you. I bought the bank that holds your mortgage. You aren't just fired from Xinguang. You're being erased from the industry. One by one, she called them out. She cited dates, account numbers, and specific betrayals with a terrifying, mathematical precision. It was a systematic dismantling of a corrupt empire, performed by the woman they had trusted to polish their desks. The room emptied as if a drain had been pulled. One by one, the men who had ruled Seoul's economy fled the room, leaving behind only the scent of stale sweat and the wreckage of their ambition. When the last director scurried out, the heavy doors slammed shut. The silence that followed was heavy and sweet. Veronica finally let her shoulders drop, her fingers gripping the back of the chairman's chair until her knuckles turned white. Young-jae walked toward her, his movements slow and careful. He didn't say a word. He reached out and gently unpinned the V. Jones name tag from her gray uniform. He looked at the cheap plastic for a moment before dropping it onto the empty table. They're gone, Veronica, he said softly. She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with a decade's worth of unshed tears. I thought I'd feel more powerful. You don't need to feel powerful, Young-jae replied, taking her hand and pressing it against his heart. You just need to be free. The victory in the boardroom was a surgical strike, but the roots of the Xinguang group ran deeper than corporate filings. They ran into the dark, damp earth of the Seoul underworld where the Mafia elders, the Council of Shadows, did not recognize the authority of a notarized deed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the city in shades of bruised purple and gold, the elevator in the executive wing didn't chime. Instead, the power flickered and died, plunging the 48th floor into a suffocating, artificial twilight. The emergency lights kicked on, bathing the marble in a haunting rhythmic red pulse. Young-jae, Veronica whispered, her hand finding his in the dark. I know, he rasped. He reached into the underside of the mahogany table, pulling out a heavy, matte black handgun he had hidden months ago. He didn't look like a CEO anymore. The transition back to the dragon was instantaneous and terrifying. The heavy oak doors didn't open, they were kicked off their hinges. 4 men entered, moving with a synchronized lethality that the boardroom directors could only dream of. At their center walked Elder Moon, a man whose skin looked like yellowed parchment and whose eyes held the cold emptiness of a deep-sea predator. He carried a traditional cane, but he didn't lean on it, he held it like a scepter. You traded your heritage for a woman and a ledger, Young-jae, Moon said, his voice a dry wheeze that cut through the hum of the backup generators. The family made you. The family can unmake you. The family died when you murdered my father for wanting to go legitimate, Young-jae countered, stepping in front of Veronica, his body a living shield. Elder Moon glanced at Veronica, his gaze dripping with a century of ingrained prejudice. And you, the little architect. You think you own this building? A building is just a box. We are the fire that burns the box down. He raised his hand, a silent signal for the gunmen to level their weapons. The tension was a physical cord, vibrating until it was ready to snap. Wait, Veronica said, her voice cutting through the gloom with a sudden, chilling clarity. She stepped out from behind Young-jae. She wasn't holding a gun, but her phone was raised, the screen glowing. Elder Moon, check your personal accounts. Not the ones in Seoul. The ghost accounts in Macau. The old man froze. One of the gunmen checked a tablet and paled, leaning in to whisper in Moon's ear. I didn't just buy the company, Veronica said, her eyes locking onto the elders. I tracked the lineage of every blood money payment made to the council for 30 years. If a single shot is fired in this room, the evidence goes to the International Criminal Court, and every asset you've hidden from the tax authorities is seized. You won't just be out of a company, you'll be out of a life. Moon's grip on his cane tightened until his knuckles cracked. For the first time, the predator looked like prey. The silence stretched, a high-stakes poker game played in a room smelling of ozone and impending death. "You're a gambler, girl," Moon hissed. "No," Veronica replied, the red light reflecting in her steady eyes. "I'm the house. And the house always wins." The storm had passed, leaving the Seoul skyline scrubbed clean and glistening under a blanket of stars. On the private observation deck of the Shingguang Tower, the wind was a gentle cool touch against the skin, carrying the distant, rhythmic hum of a city that was finally under new management. Veronica stood at the glass railing, her grey maid's uniform replaced by a tailored suit of deep emerald. The heavy chain around her neck no longer felt like a secret, it held the wedding band she had finally moved to her finger. Beside her, Young-jae leaned against the steel beam, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the dragon tattoo. In the moonlight, the ink no longer looked like a mark of shame or a warning of violence. It looked like a relic of a life he had finally outrun. "The council is silent," Young-jae said, his voice no longer the jagged growl of a mobster, but the steady tone of a man at peace. Moon retreated to the shadows. "He knows that if he breathes in your direction, the digital guillotine falls." Veronica looked out at the lights of the city, her eyes reflecting the glowing grid of the streets below. "I spent 10 years imagining this moment. I thought I'd be standing here alone, holding the keys to a graveyard." She turned to him, the sharp angles of her face softening as she reached out to touch the bandage on his hand, now just a fading memory of the struggle. "I didn't expect to find someone who would burn the world down just to help me build a better one." Young-jae took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. The power dynamic that had once defined them, CEO and servant, predator and prey, had dissolved into something far more potent. They weren't just partners in a corporate empire, they were sovereigns of their own making. "You didn't just save my father's legacy, Veronica," he whispered, pulling her closer until their foreheads rested together. "You saved the man I was supposed to be. This building, this name, it belongs to you. But I belong to you too." "We belong to each other," she corrected, a small, triumphant smile tugging at her lips. "And we have work to do. The Jones Shin group starts tomorrow. No more shadows. No more ghosts." He leaned down, kissing her with a slow, lingering heat that tasted of victory and the quiet promise of a future they had stolen back from the hands of fate. Behind them, the massive glass doors of the penthouse stood open, the lights of the office glowing like a lighthouse. The maid was gone. The Mafia was dead. In their place stood two equals, looking out over a kingdom that finally knew their names.